Welcome to How to Trust Your Intuition, the podcast, the place where we learn that trust is earned and not given, even with ourselves. I'm your host, Betsy LaFay. I'm a social worker, turned award-winning psychic medium, turned intuition teacher. And my school, Trust Yourself Intuition School, celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2023. Join us each episode as we interview thought leaders and luminaries in every genre. They talk about how and when they learn to trust their intuition. Most say they're still learning. What happens when they do trust it, and what happens when they don't. Stick around as we all walk together down the road towards trusting our intuition. Welcome back to another episode of How to Trust Your Intuition. So happy to be back here today. Today's interview really blew my mind. Let me just give you a little bit of backstory. When I started to invite people to the show that I did not know at all or did not know very well, at first I became really obsessed with making sure that my values aligned with theirs. I have very specific views on a lot of different things that may not be popular or aligned with other people. And I was overprotective in a way that is normal coming from the trauma that I have in my life. And what usually happens is if somebody heals from said trauma, then their boundaries tend to relax a little bit, not like they have lax boundaries, but they realize a middle ground. They don't go from total extremes, no boundaries, all boundaried up. There's more of a fluidity. And that's really what's happened to me. I realized shortly after I was obsessively researching everyone before I invited them to be on the show that, yeah, the universe did have my back. And that if I interviewed someone on my show and we found out some unsavory information about them later, that it was just an interview, that I didn't really need to obsess about the safety of the situation, and that the universe would guide me. So when it came to this last round of podcast invites, I was inviting people that I had never met before. And I invited Robert Kendall onto the show. I really did not know who he was. I know he had his own podcast. I knew that he was a coach and that we ran in some of the same entrepreneurial circles. I was excited to have him on the show. And you'll hear through this interview how he answers all three questions, right? How did he learn to trust his intuition? What happens when he does? What happens when he doesn't? And he never mentioned the primary thing that most people know him for. So some of you listening right now know exactly who he is by hearing his name, Robert Kendall. Some are probably like me, like, I don't know who that is. Some of you might think he sounds familiar. For the people who do know who he is, if you have been negatively impacted by his work, then I encourage you to listen, because there is a personal healing for me that happens after the official interview is over. So when I tape these things, there's an intro that doesn't make it into the show. And when we're done with the interview, the recording still keeps going, but we keep chatting. And for this episode, Robert has given me permission to include our conversation that we had after the official podcast was over. And that is where he personally apologized to me for any harm that his past actions may have caused. For people who don't know who he is, you might be like, what the heck did this guy do? We talk about what he does, or we talk about what he did after the interview is over. And I think if you can, I encourage you to not Google his name right away. Stick with us and learn in the flowing way that I did. I am going to say, for people who do or do not know him, that on this show before. I've talked about cults, how I was raised in a cult and taken advantage of and abused by cults. And he was involved, a co-founder in one of these damaging communities. And you'll hear after the interview is over exactly how I was affected and why this created a personal healing for me. So thank you so much for being here. This is a very impactful show, and I thank you for listening. Welcome, Robert.
Hello, glad, really happy to be here.
Yeah, me too. So we met through a very special group of entrepreneurs, and I'd love for you to let the audience know a little bit about you so they know who you are.
I've had a fascinating career. The way I like to tell my story, I was normal till I was 28. I'm 52 now, so I guess it's been quite a while of the unnormal. I went to Burning Man and when I was 28 in 1998, and my
Mm-hmm.
whole life just kind of etch a sketch from that moment. I went from pretty straight vanilla following the American dream to going off that beaten path to a more specific. I started a company about relationships and intimacy and sexuality in 2004. Did that for 10 years. Then started my own consulting firm in 2014 with two kind of sides. One was the fractional CFO business, helping small businesses, especially women-run businesses, on the kind of the support and finance side, and then also had this thought leader personality, which we probably met at UAL at. I've written a book called Unhidden, a book for men and those confused by them, how to podcast for 5 years, do private coaching, and yeah, that's kind of who I am.
That's great. I have some questions for you just about what you said.
Okay,
I'll sort of work my way backwards.
sure.
So, first of all, I find it interesting. I'm sort of in this group of people too, but I've sort of fallen into high level entrepreneurs that have like parallel sort of paths to yours. Maybe not just starting off as normal, but sort of starting off as um, coaching other people on
Mm,
intimacy, sexuality, which I've done as well.
mm.
And, sort of coming out of that. And then not that it's better or anything, but moving higher up in business, sort of more big picture and the consulting, as you said, the fractional CF, what was it? Fractional
CFO.
CFO, yes.
Yeah,
I'm a little dyslexic, so some of those
no worries, no worries.
sometimes. Um, and it's really fascinating to me. It feels to me as though there's so much learning. It's almost like a base learning of entrepreneurship and people, and you can sort of take it to another level with more expertise. And we just wind up seeing our unique skills and offering them in a bigger way. Would you say that sort of like fits your path?
Yes, the fractional CFO was supposed to fund the thought leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of steady, and I was able to help small businesses. And then I realized that the thought leader business was a little egoic and not quite my path. It was
Mm-hmm.
almost like an itch I had to scratch,
Mm-hmm.
something. And what I truly love is helping small businesses because Tony Robbins has this great distinction. There's three people needed for every business. There's the visionary artist,
Mm-hmm.
there's the manager, and there's the entrepreneur. The visionary artist is, really the creator, the magic, the force of the business, the idea person, um, which is great. You need that to start a business. But those people are pretty horrible usually at running all the back end parts of the business, all the taxes and finances and payroll and all the intricacies of, the back end of the business. And so I just found myself just really with those skills and enjoying being the man behind the curtain, helping the visionary artists do what they do. And just
Mm-hmm.
to finish it up, the entrepreneur is defined by Tony Robbins as the one to really promote the business. They're the networker, they're the marketer. And so his viewpoint is you need all three to really have a business get to the next level. One person can do all three, but to get to the next level of magic, and exposure, you do need all three, or that one person is too taxed to bring it to the next level.
Thank you for sharing that. That actually helps me out with some of the things I've been thinking about. I wind up coaching and teaching. It just sort of happens. People who might be on the normal path and
Yeah.
then want to start their own business, usually sort of spiritually oriented. And they are the visionary and
Yeah.
they do not realize the other two parts
Yes.
of this. And I try not to have like sort of pet peeves, but we all have things that annoy us.
Sure.
And there's a friend of mine who I really appreciate, who is an author of a really amazing book. We need the knowledge in the world. And he usually says things like, well, I hope the book gets out there, or I just don't feel right about, really pushing it for money. And luckily last time we hung out, it just sort of fell in my lap and I could just sort of gracefully be like, hey, the way I see it is, if I don't get my message out there, if the people don't find particularly my intuition school, then I haven't done my job. I really feel that way. And I could sometimes I do have a team. In fact, I had this amazing assistant for 4.5 years, and it was a dream because there would be just certain parts of the business, especially the manager part, that would either, turn me into a rage or make me fall asleep, or both. And she'd just be like, that's what I love doing, which is what you're describing. It's like, give me that. I love doing that. And just the message that there are people who prefer to support and not be in the front. That's great. I have two other questions about your bio, as it were, your intro. One is I personally understand this, but I'd love to hear you speak about it. Moving from sort of the intimacy coaching and understanding men and understanding women to supporting particularly women-owned business. Can you talk about that? I mean, as a man, okay, now my mission is mainly supporting women-owned businesses. Can you tell me about that?
Well, you have a whole podcast on that topic alone, I'm sure. There's so many changing dynamics in our society, and really in the last 50 years, in terms of, relationships of men and women. You look at the status quo of, let's say, the 1970s to the status quo of 2023, and it's very skewed. It's very different, especially women's role in society. Women entrepreneurs in 1970s doesn't exist. I'm sure there were some. I'm not saying, but very rare. I mean, women couldn't even get business credit cards without a man's co-signature in the 1970s, and I think until the 1980s.
I don't think we could get a land either. I think we needed a man to
purchase land.
Yeah, land a house.
I don't know that specific thing, but that sounds about right from my research. So here we are in 2023, and predominantly, more and more women entrepreneurs. I'm not saying it's equal at this point, but you just see the exponential rise in percentages from the CEO boardroom from 0 to, I think there was 13 or 14 in the the top 500, et cetera, et cetera. There's a multiple change. Now, underneath that, a woman who wants to connect to her feminine side, which I'm not saying is mandatory. I'm saying this is a woman who wants to run a business which does require masculine skills, and I can describe masculine and feminine if you want. But a person who identifies as a woman needs to be in touch with both her masculine and her feminine. And that changes. And what a lot of women in the workplace are seeing is that they're having to disconnect to the feminine to exist in the man's world. And so for me, as someone who speaks both manese and womanese, or masculine and feminine, the ability to translate and to discuss and to encourage to find that balance, both in the role of CEO, but also in their personal life, is it's been a really thrilling thing for me to do, and I think really important, because I do think, I'll say the last thing here, is I think we need a lot more feminine in the business world. I think there's a lot of masculine dominated, controlling, and the toxic side of masculine in the business. I think the marriage of the two is really important.
Well, I definitely agree. We could do multiple episodes on
Mhm.
this. And I think you did a great job explaining. I don't think we really need to get into all of that. But what I will say is when I was doing the intimacy coaching, I mean, that's basically what I was focusing on. My sort of tagline was if you're successful in business, but not in relationships, are you really successful?
Mhm.
And that was sort of leaning towards women who were not paying attention to, suppressing whatever their feminine side and just being as manly as possible. And I
Mhm.
think, even though my assistant was identifies as female, we're both queer. That, as you mentioned, like the taxes and all the behind the scenes stuff, that is more of what she would do. And that allowed me literally, like, I would be like, oh, I can relax. Like I
Mhm.
can be in my body. So
Mhm.
yeah, I've definitely experienced that firsthand and helped with that as well. So one more question about what you shared. And again, we could probably do multiple episodes on this, but what basically two questions. What brought you to Burning Man for the first time? And then in a shorter summary, like what was it that sort of broke you open from normal to not normal?
My first wife, Carol, was the one who got me to Burning Man.
Mhm,
This was 1998. So Burning Man was not as big a part of our culture.
mhm,
I'm not saying it's a huge part of our culture, but it was definitely not well as known. It was sort of a San Francisco fringe. We happened to be in San Francisco. She went to massage school. She said, "Do you want to go to Burning Man?" I said, "Absolutely not. It's only for those, other people, the hippies and the doulas and the massage therapists." And she's like, "Please." And I was like, "Okay." And then ended up in Burning Man going and actually finding a different part of myself, a huge part of myself, really connected to my sexuality and my relationship to my wife and my honesty. And all these things happened on a walk at Burning Man, where really just this whole other side was able to come out and actually be seen and have a conversation. So, that was 1998. So my whole, it's been quite the journey since then. And, who I was walking into that Burning Man is very different from the man I am today.
that's really cool. I went to Burning Man once, and since it was my first time and whatever, it wasn't as amazing as a lot of people say. I'm also just like not a desert person, so that was
Hmm.
difficult. But
Yeah.
I did see one talk by this superpower woman in business, and that definitely changed my life. Just her enthusiasm, and as I think about it, she might have been the person that solidified um, it's great for me to make things that help people, but
Mm.
if we don't get those other roles in place, whether it be by me or someone else, then I'm not actually I'm actually doing my job.
Right. Right.
um, awesome. Okay, well let's get into some questions here. Can you tell us about how or when or your continuing practice of learning to trust your intuition?
It really had to start with that Burning Man trip
That's cool. Oh yeah,
on
exactly.
some level, because I was, raised a New York Jew.
Mhm.
And so all the rules and concepts and ideas about that, you saved 2x if you wanted to spend 1x on something pleasurable, or something non-necessity. Everything was about status and position. I was, told from a very young age that I would not be successful unless I produced male prodigy, progeny to carry on the family name. So there was very strict rules. And so everything was very logic based in my life. And I was successful as a logic based person. I had a house in San Francisco. I had married a fascinating and beautiful woman. I had 401k and all those things. But there was this whole other part of me that was vacant. And at 28, I was overweight, disillusioned, and lost all the enthusiasm I had as a young man. because I was so fit into that corporate world. Then went to Burning Man. Everything got etch-a-sketched, and all the rules that I thought were true had to be re-examined. Then I got involved in sensuality work, which enabled me to feel, period, and mystical things that happened in the practices that I did to break down my ego and my thought processes. And now here I am 22 years later from those experiences, 24 years later, and I rely on my intuition as much, if not more, than my intellectual pursuits. Now it's a balance. And if we want to equate the intuition to the feminine, I think it's not quite a one-on-one match, but just to use that as a form, my feminine shows me things that my masculine can't see, and my masculine holds the container for things my feminine can't see. And so I have to hold both in equal value and tell them to talk to each other and relate. When the information comes in from the feminine, that person's not treating you well, but wait, they're paying this bill, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden there's a
That's
dialogue.
a perfect example. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
There's a dialogue there that enables me to make better decisions.
That's amazing. That's really, really great. I love the way that you explained that. Okay, so then let's talk about a time perhaps when your intuition was telling you something, and maybe you ignored it, and what happened?
I was involved for 10 years with a company. I worked with a very powerful woman who, I say publicly, provided the most gifts with me in my life, definitely gave me the most gifts, and also caused the most trauma, caused the most PTSD. And the paradox of that, the paradox of being someone so exciting, not as a romantic partner, but as a business partner, so exciting, so empowering, so, expansive, at the cost of my own personal well-being. And so I was, really with that person for really 12 years when I think about it. At year 10, I started to have an inkling that something was off, and I ignored it. I remember just being like, that can't be right. But year 11, when I started to have some physical responses, basically an ulcer starting to form, and acid reflux, and, throwing up, and all those, negative things, that I started to examine that intuition that I had ignored, really what it came down to. And I had intuitive skills. I just chose to ignore it at that point. And so from that, year 11, I started to plan my escape, and I left a year later from that experience. And again, so grateful for those 12 years, for all the gifts, so questioning of those 12 years because of the PTSD, but really the paradox of that experience.
That is a very powerful story. It's something that I feel like in general in our culture, we have started to open Pandora's box. The box specifically being very powerful leaders who are magnetic and really do shift our lives in powerful ways and empowering ways. But, there's no real percentage, but also 50% are causing damage, are controlling, and have these long-lasting effects. I definitely have had many of those. And, you said it yourself, but for anyone else who's kind of going through this, there's in the original Cinderella story, I won't go through the whole thing, but there's a point where she's in the woods and she meets this powerful, kind of gruesome looking witch. She's Baba Yaga. She's part of nature. She's not negative. She's not positive. She's just a force. And in order for Cinderella to get back home, she has these 3 tasks she needs to do. And really, it's a prescription for how to trust your intuition. And one of them is there's this gigantic pile of poppy seeds and dirt together. And Cinderella's task is to separate the poppy seeds from the dirt. And I feel like that is what this dissecting the past is like, was this trauma bonding or abuse?
Mm-hmm.
Was this an actual practice that is helpful? Maybe it was both. Maybe I have to turn it around. And it's definitely an initiation to really trusting our intuition. So thank you for sharing that story. It's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, how about a time when you did trust your intuition, perhaps despite strong logic, and what happened as a result?
You're all ready for your vacation. It's really hectic getting here, but you're seated in your airplane seat, looking out the window, and you hear the pilot come on the intercom. Good day, everyone. It's a beautiful day outside, 71 and sunny. As you're aware, to get to where we're going, we need to fly over that mountain range, and sometimes there can be a little bit of turbulence. I'm about 80% sure we'll get there safely. So buckle up, relax, and enjoy your flight. I know that sounds like an absurd situation, but when I put this in context of trusting yourself and trusting your intuition, and I ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, how much do you trust yourself? 8 is a very high score when asking people. So if you fall on a 2 to 4 range, you're totally not alone. Now picture this other scenario. You're out to lunch with a friend, and the friend says that they've been having a really difficult time learning French. You ask the logical question, are you taking a class? And their answer is, well, I'm taking Spanish. Guess what? If you want to trust yourself deeply, if you want to have an easier time making decisions, break through blocks, connect with people, know who to connect with, when, there's a class for that. I've actually helped thousands of people truly trust themselves in uncertainty, in times of doubt or fear, shame or guilt. And I have a free masterclass called Intuition 101, How to Trust Yourself in Uncertain Times, that will tell you everything you need to know in order to learn to trust yourself. The link is in the show notes. However, you can also go to howtotrustyourintuition.com, all spelled out.
Mm-hmm. All right. So how about a time when you did trust your intuition, perhaps despite strong logic, and what happened as a result?
I think that there's been many, many cases of that perspective. I remember a client who came to me with a lot of trauma and a lot of money and a lot of offerings of, really income for me. And it was attractive. And my ego said, take the gig, take on the role, and just do it. You can do it. And there was a little voice inside of my head said, this is outside your range. You just don't have the time, energy, and expertise to really be of service to this person. And you could actually cause more harm because your particular coaching technique is detrimental to this person. So I'm knocking down, on some level, a 6-figure gig from knowing that this was just not a good case for me. And so what I did is I had working with a somatic therapist in Los Angeles at the time, and I talked to him about it, of course not using any names, but talked to him about it and said, you're right, it sounds like you're outside your range. He was a very straight shooter. Outside your range, why don't you hook them up with this type of therapy? And what I did is I went back to the person and said, listen, I don't want you to feel abandoned, but I don't think I have the skills for you. Why don't you go to this modality that my professional therapist said? Then he went, and I stayed in touch with another 6 or 8 months, but he says it was helping. Mm-hmm. And just that moment of just like that little voice that was very quiet compared to the very loud, egoic voices, I'm grateful for, because I know I might have really hurt another person, and it might do no harm belief system that would have been horrible, and also the time and energy it would have sucked up. So anyway, it was those little moments of time.
Oh, yeah. Well, intuition will never not be subtle, or if it's not subtle, you really don't want to be in that situation, like getting an ulcer or getting in a crash or something like that. You don't want it to be. That example that you gave is really great in terms of, as I mentioned, the people that I help. Again, it's not like something I like advertise. It just winds up happening, that either are opening or wanting to open up their own spiritual business. It's not always spiritual, but I think your perspective of, can I really give this person like what they need, and what I give, is it fully aligned? Because there was a lot of it that was, but there's that but. The people that's like a really big step. A lot of people don't want to say no, and they also have that almost like codependent need to not, quote, abandon the person, as you said. When I started, I mean, it's still my process today of doing readings 15 years ago, it's still the same. Any rando on the internet can book with me at any time. There's no screening process as far as that's concerned. But what I do every single time is, once they show up on my calendar, I just quickly feel into their energy. And my primary question is that question: do we match up? Is what I'm going to give going to match up with what not only they need, but also what they want? And over 10 years, because it kept shifting, I developed a draft to gently redirect people. And those weird sort of caveats of how to go through a procedure, and you're like, don't eat donuts and coffee on the podcast. And you're like, I would never do that, but obviously that happened at some point. Someone showed up crunching on it, and that's what would happen. It was just like, I'm not seeing anything negative in your energy, and therefore, I've had people who even got upset by me gently, graciously turning them away. But literally also 10 years after the fact, I've ran into these people, and they'd be like, you denied me a reading 10 years ago. I have the email. And then they were like, I was upset at the time, but now I realize that I wasn't ready. So I love that. And also, you happen to know somebody who could help you figure out who to send them to. That's beautiful. That's always available in intuition. When you come up with a problem, maybe you're solving something, but it creates another problem. There's always a solution available, or it's none of your business to find the solution, right?
Right.
But that's very true. That's absolutely great. Thank you for sharing all of that.
Sure.
Is there anything that you would like to promote, or you're fractioned out already as a CFO, but if you have another fraction who you serve, whatever it is you'd like to share with people?
I wrote this book, Unhidden, a book for men and those confused by them.
Yes.
It's something I'm, very proud of.
Great.
It took a year. It went through 10 revisions. It went from 80,000 words to, I think it's about 40,000 words. It's just something I really written, and it's something for men who are feeling lost in this crazy 21st century, and partners to men who want to understand really the psyche. I think men are really misunderstood in today's world. So it's on Amazon. You can always go to my website, robertkendall.com, and find it. That's probably the best thing out there. I'm always talking to clients about my fractional CFO work. So again, robertkendall.com, there's a contact form you can fill out if you're looking for help with your business. I also have other associates that I can refer you to, or other business. If I'm happy to chat and do a free consultation at any time. But yeah, there's two things, the book and the CFO services.
That's great. Well, I'll put those links down in the show notes.
When I graduated with a BA in psychology in 2002, attachment work was only applied to children. Now, in 2023, it seems to be all the rage for a reason, because knowing your attachment type, there are 3 main types: avoidant, anxious, and secure, really changes your life. And if you listen to the podcast where I talked about how I lost $100,000 from a spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual coach, the silver lining to that experience was me discovering the root of a lot of my issues. I was anxiously attached. I had anxious attachment. At the very end of that terrible, terrible situation, yes, it was traumatic, I came across Maya Diamond's work. And it was working through her program that literally rewired my brain from anxious to secure. This is how I made it through all of my major transitions over the past 2 years and discovered so much about myself. Now, if you don't know about attachment work, don't feel bad. Here's a typical situation, in fact, the most common situation that happens with these attachment styles. Person A and person B are in a relationship. They care about one another. Person A reaches out to person B, doesn't hear back right away. So then maybe sends another text or another gesture, which further pushes person B away. Both people get resentful, and eventually they might break up. I was in that situation more often than I'd like to remember. I married the wrong person, I had toxic family relationships, and had no idea until I took Maya's program. So, the link for a free consultation is in the show notes, and I'm so happy to offer it all the podcast listeners. If you sign up for her program, you will get a free session worth $500 with Maya Diamond herself, one-on-one. That's just for How to Trust Your Intuition podcast listeners.
All right, I'm just popping in real quick to let you know, this is the part where the official interview is over and we continue our conversation. I did beep out the name of our mutual friend, but I refrained from asking her specifically because she's in new baby land. She's got a toddler and a baby. Speaking of trusting your intuition, so I stopped. Well, I mean, the recording's still going.
Yeah.
Speaking of trusting your intuition, as soon as you said in your very opening of your path, you're like, oh, and I went to this thing. I don't even know what you said. You didn't even say like you joined a community or whatever, but you're like, I studied and I opened up my, and I was like, and I wanted to ask you a question. I was like,
Sure.
I was like, no, I'm not going to, I was like, no, it doesn't feel right to ask now. Then when I was asking the questions, I was like, I'm going to ask this question. I was like, nope, not going to ask it. And then when you shared your answer to, with your ulcer and the 12-year relationship, I was like, yeah, I know who he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I'm going to tell you, but, and I was like, I'm so glad I didn't ask, because the way you shared the story, you did not give any tells away to the general public. And you did that for a purpose. Mm-hmm. And had I asked the question, I'm not sure you would have been uncomfortable. We could have cut it out or whatever. But the question I wanted to ask from the very beginning, were you ever involved in the OM community?
I was a co-founder of the OM community.
See, I didn't know that. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And yeah, so as soon as you were like, oh, the 11, 12, I was like, oh, it was at that moment when you mentioned those numbers, like, oh, I actually even know who you are now, because I know there was a person in that role, mm-hmm. So, and it's amazing. I also didn't want to bring it up because it is a gigantic can of worms. And so my experience with them, if you don't mind if we talk about this, do you?
No, that's great.
To be honest, it's like, this is something that on a personal level, I've wanted to talk to someone about, because because we're all unpacking, right?
Yeah.
So if you're uncomfortable with any of this, you can.
I'm totally comfortable. I have no problem with it.
Yeah, I'm an open book too.
Yeah.
So I was in New York,
Mhm.
and it was growing, and I heard about it, whatever. Then I had a friend down in Austin, Texas,
Okay.
who became, I don't know if you would ever have known her or not, but she became one of the darlings, but also one of the darlings because she's a very bright light. And she just was willing to do everything all of the time for free and be so excited that she was chosen to do it. And
Yeah.
so, she became this, part of the Texas group. And she kept saying, I was with a guy at the time for a long time. She kept saying, you guys should do Om, you guys should do Om. And so I've been involved in cults. I definitely call that a cult throughout my life. I was raised in a cult, all these things. So this is like something that I don't even know how I basically missed this one. I mean, I do know, but at the time, this was in New York, where the trainings were happening, where this was before the shortage of men, right? Or shortage of women. Anyone could walk in at any time. And the place they were doing it from in New York also had windows in the room. And there were reports of, like, during the practice, when the strangers were doing the Om practice on each other, had just met, creepy dudes would walk in the room and just like walk around. And so it was like, oh, hell no. Oh, hell no. So that's her name, down in Texas.
I love
She's amazing. She's a good
an amazing human being. Yeah.
She's so amazing. Did you know they're pregnant again?
I heard. Yeah.
Oh, that's so great that you know her.
Yeah. She's really, I don't like top 5 humans in the world.
I can't wait to
contact
my name.
She would, yeah.
That's cool. And that's why she was, and I use it a little sarcastically, but the darling, because she is so amazing, right?
Yeah.
I kept telling her from the very beginning, before I knew any of this, I was like, you should be getting paid. You should ask for pay, not knowing the whole thing. So anyways, I was like, the only way I would ever do this is if it was in my house and you trained us. So one of the times she came up for training, she stayed with us and she gave us a private thing. Well, I was actually I became married to this guy, a narcissist. So, he kind of imploded that practice and whatever. Then when I was in LA for 3 years, it still continued to be like so close to me. I was not involved, but all the people that I was close to, this was like towards the end, but it's a typical story that like their whole community was in it. If they left, they would be shunned, so they couldn't get out, all of that stuff. And so because of that, I just discovered the podcast in the last like 3 months, maybe, the BBC podcast, listened to that whole thing, and then watched the Netflix thing. So I don't need you to say anything about that.
I think the intentions of One Taste were very mixed. If you would ask me in 2004, 2007, 2008, 2009, I'd be like, no, we want to change the world and empower women. And, I bought it and sold it. And even though I was bypassing my boundaries left and right and, incurring that PTSD, I still believed in the concept. It was just this beautiful dream that Nicola sold. And here I am, I left in 2014, and here I am, almost 8 years removed. And I'm more confused now than I was when I left in terms of what were the true motivations. And
I just want to say, thank you for saying that. It's the most difficult place to be in, but in my opinion, the most beautiful, because it's fucking real.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And I watched the documentary, which I thought was the most honest. I didn't like the BBC. I thought it was very skewed. But the documentary was balanced with a goal, et cetera, et cetera. And then, afterwards, talking to Morgan's, second wife, best friend, Betsy, and just, continue to pull through it, really came back to like questions of motivations. Watching the whole NXIVM, I don't know if you put any energy into that cult.
I mean, I've almost all of them I've seen.
Yeah. Watching stuff on NXIVM and comparing, it's just been a lot of the question all along. The Ross question is, was it Nicole's covert motivation to abuse people for her own, power, her own, gain, compared to that, oh, we're doing this to serve the world. So I get anyone who walked into the field, especially sensitive beings, could feel both sides or the, harmful side. So I just have a standard, just statement that if any harm was caused by you by something I co-created, I want you to know I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you had that experience, at the raw sense, and to validate your feelings, whatever they were, as true, because that's the biggest crime one tasted, was to gaslight people, especially victims. They were very powerful gaslighters, and that's the saddest part, is that victims can't even get reality that what they went through was off.
I really feel like I can put this, no pun intended, to bed now. Seeing the survivors and seeing them dealing with it and seeing them share and coming out with it has just really healed me. When you said, like, I'm sorry, like, what I was actually feeling was like all the people that I know that were affected deeply, because I wasn't directly, I have a whole bunch of just vicarious trauma too. So it's like those people that I still can't be friends with, but like, while I was friends with them, not knowing I couldn't do anything else, I was hurting for them and in conflict, like basically judging them, being like, you're in a cult, get out. I didn't say those things, right? But I would encourage them to get out. And it was frustrating because Om was keeping them from being the friends that I wanted them to be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So when you said, I'm sorry, I rushed that over to them, and I'm just hoping, I'm not going to contact them, but I'm hoping energetically they can feel that. So this is so incredible. You're such a gift. Thank you.
My pleasure.
How to Trust Your Intuition, the podcast, is written, produced, and created by me, your host, Betsy LaFay. Music provided by Ben Talmy. If you don't want to be like that pilot that is 80% sure you'll get to your next destination safely, and you want to take the right class to learn the right language, and guess what? Intuition is a language. Head over to howtotrustyourintuition.com. I hope this podcast has been helpful to you. If it has, please forward it to a friend who you think it could also make a difference for. There's something that you can do for me and everyone else who listens to this podcast as well. If you hit subscribe, you'll never miss another episode. It'll also help the show get to other people. And of course, I know you've heard other podcast hosts say this before, but it's totally true. If you leave us a 5-star rating and a review, it helps other people like you discover this podcast. We all need to learn to trust our intuition. So, hit subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and write a little blurb while you're there. Your intuition will thank you.